Most people never complete their spiritual awakening, not because their strength falters or their will breaks, but because the very foundation of who they believe themselves to be begins to tremble and crack. The identity you've constructed, layer by layer, through years of adaptation, survival, and social conditioning, starts to fracture under the weight of a truth too vast to be contained by the self you've known. Spiritual awakening does not arrive as a polite guest, knocking gently at your door, with promises of serenity and light. It crashes into your life like a tempest, tearing at the walls of the persona you've built to shield yourself from the rawness of existence. The beliefs you've clung to, the roles you've played, the narratives you've repeated to feel secure, all of these begin to dissolve, leaving you standing amidst the debris of a life you thought was solid. In this moment, panic seizes the mind, the heart tightens in resistance, and the ego grips tightly to what it knows. For many, the intensity of this dismantling is too much to bear. They turn away, seeking refuge in distractions, in numbing routines, in the comfort of the familiar. Not because it satisfies, but because it's a known quantity in a world suddenly turned chaotic. The cultural story of awakening paints it as a blissful pinnacle, a moment of divine clarity, but it rarely speaks of the disorientation, the raw ache of loss, the silence that roars louder than any sound. The masks you've worn for so long, crafted to please, to protect, to belong, begin to peel away, and you're left staring at a stranger in the mirror, a face you barely recognize. Yet this is not the end. It is the sacred beginning, the threshold for those brave enough to stay, to sit with the discomfort, to face the reflection without flinching. From this chaos, a deeper truth emerges. A quieter self rises, not one polished by approval or shaped by expectation, but the authentic self, buried beneath layers of performance and pretense. Carl Jung described this plunge into the unconscious as a critical stage of individuation, the necessary breaking apart before the remembrance of wholeness. Awakening is not about becoming someone new. It is about uncovering what you've always been beneath the noise. The cost is steep. Everything that once gave you a false sense of safety must be surrendered. But for those who press forward, something extraordinary unfolds. A self that is awake, rooted, real, and unshakable. The journey begins not with light, but with a thinning of the veil, a subtle shift that reveals the fragility of the stories you've lived by. You look around, and the world appears unchanged. Yet something within you starts to crumble. Not your physical form, not your intellect, but the invisible framework of meaning that once defined your existence. The titles you carried, the convictions you defended, even the cherished ideals you held close, begin to feel hollow, as if they've outlived their purpose. This is not a flaw or a failure. It is the precise moment Jung highlighted when he declared, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Awakening is not a soothing balm. It is a confrontation. It forces you to face the illusions you've built, the half-truths you've accepted, the realization that what you once called purpose may have been a shield, a temporary structure to protect you from a truth your soul wasn't ready to embrace. These weren't deceptions in the cruel sense. They were scaffolding, practical constructs to help you navigate a world too complex, too overwhelming, when you were still unprepared. But now, something changes. The old frameworks no longer hold you. You feel like a stranger in your own story, moving through routines that once brought comfort, but now ring empty. This is the rupture, the existential wound, the call to dive deeper. Surface-level answers no longer satisfy. Borrowed beliefs no longer suffice. The collapse of these structures isn't punishment, it's liberation. It's not the end of meaning, but the dawn of truth. When your inner world begins to dissolve, you aren't breaking apart, you're breaking into awareness. Though it feels like a crisis, it's the soul's quiet rebellion against a life that no longer mirrors its depth. This is the moment you stop performing and start awakening, not in radiance, but in the sacred darkness. From that darkness, something ancient stirs, not with grandeur, but with a subtle presence, whispering through the void left by what once defined you. You first notice it in the stillness, in the persistent ache that lingers in spaces that once felt full. The ambitions you chased grow distant, as if they belong to a version of you that no longer exists. The people who once mirrored your identity no longer feel like anchors. The possessions or achievements that sparked joy now pass through you, leaving no trace. This isn't disarray. It's the gradual unfolding of an inner death. The ego, the self you crafted to survive, begins to fray. This isn't mere metaphor. It's a psychological truth. Your sense of self unravels. The reflection in the mirror feels foreign. The inner voice that once guided your days sounds like a stranger's echo. Jung spoke of this as the confrontation with the unconscious, where what awakens is sacred, but only after the false self crumbles to make way. The ego doesn't yield without a fight. It resists, it pleads, it clings to the known, warning you that you're lost, broken, misguided. It pushes you to retreat into old habits, labeling this process as confusion, despair, or error. But these are the defenses of a structure facing its end. The pain you feel isn't a sign of failure. It's the pressure of truth pressing against the walls of illusion. If you resist this inner death, the suffering intensifies. If you battle it, you may feel as though you're slipping into chaos. But if you surrender, not passively but with awareness, you'll sense the tearing open into something timeless. You'll touch the part of you that was never lost, only hidden. In that moment, you realize what's dying isn't your life, but the incomplete image of you that never captured your entirety. This is why most turn back. The death of the ego feels too much like annihilation. But for those who persist, what emerges isn't flawlessness, but presence. Not certainty, but truth. Not an enhancement of who you were, but a return to who you've always been. You were taught to thrive in the world, to align with its rhythms, to wear the masks it approved. But no one taught you how to be whole, how to fall inward, how to peel back the polished exterior and meet the raw essence beneath. So when this descent arrives, it feels like collapse. Yet, this isn't your ruin. It's your initiation, a spiral not into despair, but into the sacred depths of your becoming. Awakening isn't a climb to greater heights. It's a return to deeper roots. It demands not performance, but presence. Not new masks, but the courage to shed them. You'll be asked to release what was never true. Titles, roles, attachments, personas. They fall away like brittle leaves. You'll lose things, people, identities you thought would last forever. This loss isn't gentle. If you try to drag the old self into this new awareness, it will wither in your grasp. Awakening doesn't enhance your life. It deconstructs it, burning away the scaffolding of falsehood and waiting to see if you'll rebuild from truth. Most retreat here, choosing the safety of the known over the uncertainty of freedom. They opt for validation over authenticity, praise over peace, because the wilderness within is daunting. It speaks in a tongue logic can't decode, asking you to feel without numbing, to see without turning away. In that mirror, you meet not your light, but your shadow, the part of you exiled long ago, the part that cried for love and met silence, the part that learned to control, to hide, to withdraw just to survive. It returns now, not to wound, but to be embraced. True awakening requires you to welcome it with compassion, not to repair it, but to hear it. The shadow doesn't arrive quietly. It shows itself in your triggers, your defenses, your self-sabotage, in jealousy, in comparison, in the fear of being left. It surfaces when you nearly grasp what you desire, then push it away. Until you face it, you remain caught in a cycle. But the moment you turn toward it with openness, inviting it into your presence, something ancient begins to mend. The part of you that was never held finally receives the attention it craved. And in that sacred encounter, you start to recall who you were before the world taught you to forget. This is the truth few grasp. Spiritual awakening doesn't usher you into peace. It initiates you into presence. It's not the end of pain, but the moment you're asked to sit with it, to stop running, denying, or disguising it. Awakening isn't a gentle glow that comforts. It's a fire that lays you bare. It demands your grief unfiltered, your anger unashamed, your silence without escape. It calls you into the unknown with no promise of who you'll become. It's the death of the familiar self while your heart still beats, the collapse of all that was false. Even in the ruins, you're asked to say yes, not because you're unbreakable, but because you're ready to let go. This is the threshold the ego dreads most, for it thrives on illusion, on controlling the story, maintaining the facade, suppressing the unease. It was built to protect you, not to awaken you. But the soul isn't here to guard the temporary. It's here to unveil the eternal. That unveiling begins only through this unraveling. You must shed the armor you thought kept you safe, dismantle the narratives that kept you small, let the identity you clutched turn to dust. Then, in the quiet that follows, something ancient stirs, not with answers, not with demands, but with patience. It waits until your mind stills, until the performance ends, until the masks grow too heavy. Then it speaks, not in words, but in a quiet longing, a deep ache for something real. Not more success, not more recognition, but more wholeness, more truth, more life. This ache isn't a mistake. It's not weakness. It's the soul's signal that you're ready to release the lie. But most bury it, drowning it in tasks, silencing it with achievements, smothering it in distractions disguised as comfort. Answering it means letting go of the world you built to survive, and no one warns you how isolating that release will feel. The first step of awakening isn't triumph, it's exile. A departure from familiar roles, acceptable facades, the scripts you didn't realize you were following. In that exile, your old self beckons, tempting you with ease, with certainty, with numbness. But something deeper resists, because once you've glimpsed your soul, surface living no longer suffices. You find yourself in the in-between, not who you were, not yet who you're becoming. This liminal space is terrifying, yet sacred. It's the cocoon, the void, the quiet pause where your soul does its deepest work. Here, your shadow rises, no longer concealed, no longer willing to be ignored. It emerges through your triggers, your patterns, your quiet pain, not to harm, but to ask if you're ready to meet yourself fully. Every instinct trained to seek relief, to avoid discomfort, begins to shake. You were taught to flee pain, to mask it with positivity, to hide it behind spiritual platitudes. But awakening isn't an escape from pain. It's a reckoning. It asks you to turn toward the wound, not with judgment, but with presence, to descend into it, not to fix it, but to listen. Then something profound shifts. You see that pain was never your enemy, but your guide, the crack through which your buried essence could emerge. You feel the grief, the anger, the sorrow, not as defects, but as messengers, each carrying a fragment of your wholeness. The longer you stay, the more they soften. You begin to listen, and compassion rises, not just for others, but for yourself, for the child who never felt safe to weep, for the youth who hid their truth behind silence, for the adult who tied their worth to endless doing. Through this, the illusion of perfection fades. The need for performance dissolves. You no longer seek healing to be fixed. You seek truth, raw and unyielding. This is the heart of awakening. Not becoming perfect, but becoming honest. Honest about your scars, your beauty, your chaos, your contradictions. You are both human and divine, fragile and infinite, and the soul asks you to embrace both. When you do, truth becomes your anchor. Not a truth to defend, but one that frees you. You stop begging for validation from sources that can't hold your light. You stop betraying your essence for the sake of fitting in. You realize the safety you sought was never external. It was always your own presence, your commitment to stay with yourself when pain returns. When you stop running, truly stop, everything shifts. Not because pain vanishes, but because you're finally home within it. This is the barrier most never cross, not for lack of courage, but because no one taught them the sacred art of staying in the discomfort until it transforms, staying in the unknown without grasping for false answers, staying with the soul until it speaks. Yet here you are staying, and because you do, something roots within you. Not perfection, not performance, but something real, something ancient. You begin to see how much of your life wasn't yours. Dreams inherited, desires shaped by fear, molded by generations who knew survival, but not wholeness. You see the masks you wore, not to deceive, but to be loved. How often you traded truth for safety, essence for acceptance. In this seeing, a sacred fire ignites, not to destroy but to remember. A fierce resolve rises, a thunder in your chest declaring, I was not born for a life of sleep. This isn't regression. It's resurrection. The return of a self you left behind because no one taught you how to keep it alive. From this place, your voice changes. You speak less to please, more to stand. You say no with clarity, yes with peace. You no longer dilute your truth for comfort or explanation. No longer apologize for being whole. The world, once at ease with your familiarity, now finds you enigmatic. You're no longer a predictable pattern, no longer a reflection of its fear. You become a living mirror, revealing unconsciousness simply by walking in your truth. This is embodiment, not a performance of healing, but the quiet choice to live it, especially when it costs you. Some days it's tears behind the wheel as your body releases lifetimes of tension. Some days it's silence in spaces once filled with noise, now heavy with absence. Some days it's grief for a life built with care, yet no longer aligned with who you are. But beneath it all, something unshakable grows. The truth that you no longer need to prove yourself. You're no longer chasing. You're being. And that's more potent than anything you were taught to perform. This is the hidden cost of becoming. You don't just shed illusions, you shed the skins of who you thought you were. The names, the comforts, the structures that held you together collapse, and you see they no longer serve your truth. They confine it. In the stillness that follows, there's no instant clarity, no new identity to claim. There's only vastness, a sacred emptiness where the old can't survive, and the new is yet to take shape. You wake each day not knowing who you are, both newborn and ancient. Words feel fragile, plans feel uncertain, as if the future whispers, "This isn't the time to build, it's the time to listen." So you listen. Beneath the noise, the fears, the stories you once called your life, you hear a quiet murmur. Let go. Let go of the timeline, the design, the need to name this journey. Let it dismantle you, shape you in ways no plan could. Let it reveal what remains when nothing is left to defend. What remains isn't who you tried to be. It's who you were before you learned to pretend. The breath, the stillness, the pulse of presence. You meet yourself, not the persona, not the performance, but the original self, unshrunk by the world. This self doesn't chase purpose, it radiates it, not in grand achievements, but in how you move, how you speak, how you stay tender when life tries to harden you. Meaning isn't something to seize. It's something you embody, moment by moment, as you choose not to abandon yourself, even when the world misreads you. This is the deeper rhythm of awakening, a path no one can teach because it's not a lesson. It's a return, a sacred remembering of who you were before the story began. When you live from this place, the world doesn't burst into light. It quiets. But that quiet brims with truth. You no longer explain yourself to those who can't hear you, no longer trade your knowing for borrowed certainty. You stop betraying your soul for comfort. In that stillness, something profound awakens. You stop chasing love because you see you are it, here, now, in the quiet core of your being. Awakening was never about becoming an enlightened ideal. It was about remembering the truth, buried beneath survival, performance, and fear. You no longer need to pursue it. You're beginning to live it. The search ends, not with a grand revelation, but with a gentle return to what was always within. You stop running, not because the way is clear, but because you've learned to stand in the unknown and call it home. You no longer plead for validation or clarity, no longer exhaust yourself to be understood. You trust that what's meant for you will stay, not because you cling to it, but because your truth draws what aligns. You stop forcing, stop striving, stop molding yourself to fit spaces never built for your depth. You no longer mistake stillness for stagnation. You feel a strength, not from mastering life, but from rooting in your essence, no matter what comes. It's a quiet, sacred power, not one that performs, but one that simply is. A grace follows those who endure the inner collapse, not a loud grace, but one that walks softly and transforms all it touches. You carry that now, not to preach, but to reflect, not to guide, but to mirror. You become a silent call for others to meet themselves. Some may turn away, unable to face their own reflection, but others will awaken, not because you demanded it, but because your stillness stirred their own. You no longer ask, "Who am I meant to be?" You live the answer. You rest without guilt, speak without shrinking, walk without apology. You're no longer a question, but a remembering, a living flame that didn't burn you away, but burned you open. This is the quiet revolution, not to save the world, but to stop betraying yourself. And now, you don't seek the awakening. You are the awakening. If this message moved something within you, don't pause here. The next video will guide you deeper into healing, growth, and self-discovery. It might be the shift your soul has been longing for. Tap into it now. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community dedicated to truth, transformation, and real inner change. You're not alone on this journey. I'll meet you in the next video, where we continue becoming who we were always meant to be.